History as it happens, April 12, 2022. Slavery and the Constitution.
But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination.
As a man whose roots go deeply into Southern soil, I know how agonizing racial feelings are. I know how difficult it is to reshape the attitudes and the structure of our society. But a century has passed, more than 100 years, since the Negro was freed. And he is not fully freed tonight.
The triumphs of the Civil Rights era would not have been possible without conflict, without politics. Conflict over the place of black people in American society, politics to secure their rights in legislation. The struggle over American democracy goes back to the very beginning, to the Constitutional Convention itself, a history of conflict that strangely disappears in interpretations that make white supremacy the driving force in the American past. Sean Wilentz and James Oakes will take that on next as we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
There is this great struggle that no one wants to talk about. There was never a racial consensus, at least not from 1787. There wasn't a racial consensus, but it's been suppressed. And what makes it strange for me is that there's a whole crew of people, black and white, who are fighting both slavery and racism from the very beginning of American history.
March 15th, 1965, Lyndon Johnson addresses Congress the week after Selma. He wasn't known as a great orator, but this may have been his finest moment.
Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
On live TV, President Johnson told lawmakers, told millions of Americans, the country reached another critical moment in its history, in its development. It was long past time to fulfill the promise of emancipation, the promise of the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870.
The Constitution says that no person shall be kept from voting because of his race or his color. We have all sworn an oath before God to support and to defend that Constitution. We must now act in obedience to that oath.
So I guess there are a couple of ways of looking back at that moment, that it was a great victory by and for the civil rights movement. Or what took them so long? As Johnson said, a century had passed since the Civil War, and black Americans, especially in the South, were still treated as second-class citizens, denied the right to choose their own leaders. Well, that is true, of course, but if you're not impressed with the importance of that moment, you might be overlooking the better question. And that is, how did any change occur at all? The same might be said for the gradual emancipation laws passed in northern states starting in Pennsylvania in 1780. Why weren't slaves freed immediately? Why did some have to wait, in Pennsylvania's case, until their 28th birthday for freedom? Well, the answer can be found in politics. The politics that grew out of the conflict over slavery's future, a conflict spurred by the ideas unleashed by the American Revolution. This is the third installment in our occasional series on slavery and the Constitution. You can listen to Part 1 with Joseph Ellis and Part 2 with Alan Taylor by searching for those episodes of History as it Happens, wherever you find your podcasts. Today we have two guests, two major historians of 18th and 19th century America. They've taught me something very helpful about this whole debate. Instead of arguing over whether the Constitution was pro or anti-slavery, it's better to view it as a contested document if we're to understand how abolition eventually came about. That's because the ratification of the Constitution was the start, not the end, of the conflict over slavery, the start of a process. As you know from listening, Princeton's Sean Wilentz is one of my favorite historians. The Rise of American Democracy is a must-read, and so is No Property in Man, to name two of his books. James Oakes is a path-breaking scholar, too, at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. He is the author of Freedom National, and more recently, The Crooked Path to Abolition. Sean Wilentz, welcome back.
Great to be here, Martin.
And James Oakes, welcome back.
Great to be here. Thanks for having us.
I am so excited to speak to both of you, really to listen to both of you. So I think, even though I've prepared a bunch of questions, I'm going to ask one question, turn my microphone off, and you guys can carry the podcast from that point forward. Kidding.
Okay.
Kidding.
Oh, good.
Yes. These issues and debates are, of course, not new to you. You're professional historians. This is what you do. But for the rest of us, these past 2 to 3 years, we've been immersed in this debate, this discussion, this argument, provoked by the national reckoning on race, as well as some publications, the 1619 Project to name one. Are we any closer to understanding the issues here, or are we just more confused and misled? Sean Wilentz, you go first.
Well, it depends on who you mean by we. I mean, the general public is probably more confused. I think that there's been this kind of unintentional salutary effect of, helping sharpen arguments on the other side. It's not arguments that the other side wants to have because we're considered not fit to be part of it. But nevertheless, I'll speak for myself. I found my own thinking sharpened by the debate that's been going on. So that's been fine. But I'm not exactly, shall we say, not that many millions of people are listening to my Twitter account. I think I even have one. So it's been a net loss, particularly with respect to schools and the curriculum in the schools, which I think is, from the start, I always thought was the most important thing about this, actually. What goes on from day to day in newspapers or journals. You wrap fish in yesterday's newspaper, right? Even virtually, they don't matter. But schools matter and curriculum matter. And I think there we've had a net loss, a big net loss.
That was not a Godfather reference about fish in newspapers. But James, I know you want to jump in here. You wrote a great essay in Catalyst about what historians have been teaching their students at the college level about slavery.
Well, it was very difficult to tell from the way the 1619 Project was produced, and particularly the essay by Jake Silverstein, whether they were talking about what was going on in colleges versus what was going on in high schools versus what goes on in elementary schools. And I think the answer to those questions, each of those particular questions, is different. And I specifically focused on what kids have been taught in colleges, as far as we can tell, for the last 40 or 50 years. And they've all been taught, if not exactly date 1619, they've all been taught about the central significance of slavery in American history, going all the way back to the colonial period. So there's been this business about, I remember when I was a teenager, the Dick Cavett show had a rap on race with Margaret Mead and James Baldwin.
Jimmy Baldwin, right.
James Baldwin, right? And then 10 or 15 years later, John Hope Franklin orchestrated this national conversation on race, right? So we've been having this public, increasingly excruciating reckoning and conversation on race for 50 years, my entire life. And there's a kind of, I don't know quite how to explain, can we please talk about the thing we never stop talking about? And I'm beginning to suspect that my friend Adolph Reed is correct, that we talk about race when we don't want to talk about other things like economic inequality and stuff like that. At a moment in American history when we are at a peak of economic inequality, we don't want to talk about that. In the same way that before the Civil War, the slaveholders didn't want to talk about class. They wanted to talk about race. And it was the great achievement of the Republican Party to say, no, this is about you guys. This is about the slave power. This is about how much power 400,000 slaveholders have over a nation of 30 million people. And something like that happened again in the late 19th and early 20th century when this landlord merchant class consolidates its power. And instead of talking about that, they go out of their way to suppress the populist movement and institute this Jim Crow era and talk all about race. And we're at another period in American history of increasingly extreme inequality. And all we want to talk about is race, because race is what we talk about when we don't want to talk about other things.
I agree with Jim completely on this, but it's also the history that we were taught exactly that. I mean, maybe the best-selling history book, monograph, whatever you want to call it, was probably The Strange Career of Jim Crow by C. Vann Woodward from 1955 right till when I was an undergraduate, 20 years, 30 years later. That's exactly what his book is about. And it was described by Martin Luther King as the historical Bible of the civil rights movement. This was there, precisely what Jim is talking about. You know, when you want to suppress class divisions, you bring out the race stuff. Now, much of that had been done in order to suppress from above, try to suppress these class movements. Here it's coming from, oddly, it's very strange. It's kind of coming from above, but it's coming in the name of the great black masses or whatever. So it's a variation on a very, very old theme.
Right.
Well, I was going to say a race-centered interpretation, or as you put it in a recent book review, Sean, interpretations of white supremacy as the driving force of American history. It leaves out everything else, including a class-based analysis. And it's bleeding into other areas, too. We're not just talking about works of amateurism like the 1619 Project, but some historians are also subscribing to what I view as a distortion of the past.
Well, I mean, I'll take a stab at that, which is to say that what you're seeing today is not just one thing, and even of the moment. I mean, in terms of you're talking about academic historians, right? There's been this is the product of a long process. And I've been thinking about this, actually, and it's not so much about race, although I think it is too, but it's in part about basically the denigration of political history. And it's very difficult to make the arguments that are being made if you take political history seriously. There was a movement towards social history, and part of that movement was not simply an idea that you had to shift your focus from the political elites to the common people, but there was a kind of sense that you were not simply denigrating the political history, but that politics was a bad thing. And that indeed the American government served generally to do bad things, or to at least mute the possibilities of doing better things. And that was, I think, a presumption that came out of the Vietnam era, that came out of the whole business, that became hard baked into certain kinds of historical research, not all of it by any means, but American historical research right through our own time. And in a certain sense, we're seeing the culmination of that. Because basically, in a lot of these debates, you know, if you knew the first thing about political history, let alone respected it, you could not make some of these arguments, as about the American Revolution, as about Lincoln, as about any of it. If you actually know the political history, but people don't, you see. People are unaware of it. People can assume, well, maybe they did do these terrible things because we don't really know. And so it's been incumbent upon those of us who actually stuck with political history in one way or another to say, look, this is just not true. So, but that's one part of the process. There's another part of it as well, which has to do with a particular idea about American history, which really comes out of the old left in the 1930s. It showed up in the work of Eugene Genovese, who saw Black nationalism as the logical conclusion of the slave experience. And I think that it's lived on in many ways in a different form among those who were particularly influenced by Gene. And that Gene, not the Gene that later evolved, who was a very different person, very different historian. But I think that was another strain among academic historians here I'm not talking about others. But that was a strain in the literature that was also explained. And they're co-synchronous, right? I mean, you know, Roll Jordan Roll comes out in 1974. That's more or less the same time as this larger movement that's going on. So I'd attribute it as much to that as to anything that's going on today. What's going on today is important, to be sure, but it's the culmination of something that itself has a fairly long history.
Also, it's important to know that social history sort of morphed into cultural history. And the history of race became the history of racial ideology, and the history of racial ideology became exclusively the history of racism. It never became what it should have become, a history of debates over race in American history, which have always existed. And we're beginning to have important works by people like Van Goss and Kate Major and Paul Polgar, demonstrating that right from the beginning, present at the creation of the United States, was a debate among whites with great participation, important participation by Blacks over the place of Blacks in the United States, and important arguments for racial equality in favor of Black citizenship and things like that. And that got lost in the way historians tended to write about race as exclusively meaning the history of racism. And it became what I call racial consensus history. That contributed to the other problem that Sean indicated, which is the emergence of a kind of, if all whites are racist, more or less all the time, then the only hope is for a kind of quasi-independent Black nation to assert itself and do what the 1619 Project said, do on its own what it can to achieve some measure of dignity and equality without the help of white allies. All of those things have produced a situation we're in right now in which it's very difficult to discuss a long history of conflict over slavery, conflict over race in American history. It's just become all pro-slavery, all white supremacy.
Is this what we call presentism?
In part, but as I say, it comes out of a long history itself. So it's not just, reflecting it. There's an intellectual temperament, there's an intellectual assumption. There's a series of things that are in the academy, at any rate, that are hard baked. And I think actually beyond the academy too, because two generations of students have been taking this stuff, even though they say they weren't being taught it, they're being taught it in this particular way very often. Not the way that Jim and I were taught as undergraduates, but in a different way, our generation doing it. So it's presentism, but presentism with a background. It does rise to the occasion. What happened between 2019 roughly and now presented an occasion for this stuff to come up with great force and fury and great publicity, I should add. But it's not as if people started writing this way because George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. I mean, that's not what happened.
So, James Oakes, I will stay with you because I have adopted your language when discussing the Constitution. I now call it a contested document, not either pro-slavery or anti-slavery or both. A contested document, because one of the reasons I started doing this occasional series was to kind of get back to basics and go back to our founding, because that's where these debates almost always wind up. We go back to the Constitution and what it said about slavery and those initial compromises over slavery that were written into the Constitution, which seemed to overshadow in importance the abolition of slavery later on. But let's begin here with the Constitution as a contested document.
Well, it starts in the Constitutional Convention itself. The Constitutional Convention itself contained a group of people who came to Philadelphia with different ideas about slavery, having lived through an American Revolution that was itself a major world historical turning point in the history of slavery. That is, for the first time in the history of the world, a significant abolitionist movement emerged that resulted in the abolition of slavery in one state after another. The accumulation of those states comes to be called the North. And those people show up at the Constitutional Convention and begin arguing with one another. As Sean can talk better than I can about what went on in the Constitutional Convention, but it's clear to me that from that moment on, anti-slavery and pro-slavery people came away with very, very different conceptions of what the Constitution actually said about slavery. And that had important political implications because the disagreement meant very different understandings of what the federal government could or could not do about slavery, right? So we have all more or less I came to this as a Garrisonian. Right? When I was an assistant professor with Sean at Princeton, Paul Finkelman, the very distinguished legal historian of slavery, and came and gave the first version of a paper on William Lloyd Garrison, praising Garrison's interpretation of the Constitution as a compact with the devil, right? And a pro-slavery atrocity, right? And I accepted that. And when I started studying anti-slavery, I just started noticing that none of the people I was studying, except for Garrison and a few of his followers, believed that. And I just kept pushing back and back and back till I got to the same place Sean starts from, which is the American Revolution is a major turning point, and you get conflict over slavery. And that conflict shows up in the Constitution itself and shaped American politics from that moment to the Civil War.
It's the great struggle of early American history that goes unspoken about. And what has shocked me, actually, over time, and Jim and I had the same experience. I think I was at that same seminar where Paul did his thing, and it was very persuasive at the time. When I was doing a book about the Constitution myself, I was amazed to see what I was finding, that debates that I had thought started just after the convention actually started in the convention. But there is this great struggle that no one wants to talk about. That goes to the heart of what Jim said earlier about racial consensus, in fact. There was never a racial consensus, at least not from 1787, there wasn't a racial consensus, but it's been suppressed. And what makes it strange for me is that there's a whole crew of people, black and white, who are fighting both slavery and racism from the very beginning of American history. These are people, if you want to talk about tearing down monuments and building new monuments, these are the people that should be on the mall, the National Mall. And I'm talking about people as different as Absalom Jones and Gouverneur Morris. I mean, but they're there. One would think that people of goodwill, people on the left, whatever you want to say, would honor these people, would want to embrace these people, would want to see them as heroes. But they're not. They're all absorbed into this idea of blacks and whites have nothing to do with one another, that they hate each other from the very beginning, and there is no common ground. And in doing so, actually remove an entire strain of what I'll call the American radical tradition, which goes all the way to the Civil War. That's been expunged. I once wanted to write a book called The American Radical Tradition. I would never have included these people at that time, but now I would. I wish we would take account of that more than we do.
So let's talk about Garrison and his lasting influence on how we today might interpret the Constitution. I admit to having once been a Garrisonian, although I was not at that seminar that you both mentioned. My attitude was, to hell with those hopelessly compromised politicians, to hell with the irredeemable Constitution and its 3/5 clause and fugitive slave clause. And when I was younger, I found this kind of politics, if you will, outsider politics, more appealing because I'd become so disgusted with my own government during the George W. Bush administration. So when I read Henry Mayer's biography of William Lloyd Garrison, Garrison was my hero. He was my hero. He was morally correct, but I've come to realize he maybe wasn't very persuasive. Moral suasion didn't really convince many slaveholders to give up their property, but he was also wrong to eschew politics. Was he not, James Oakes?
That's a standard critique of Garrison, and there's a good reason to acknowledge that critique. He does denounce voting and he does denounce electoral politics explicitly, but many historians have since gone through The Liberator and noticed that, he was very interested in politics and he was deeply concerned with the problem of democracy. And he ended up kind of with this logical deduction that you can't participate in politics when in fact he was deeply engaged in and interested in politics. So his own record is a little more complex than that older story. The Henry Meyer biography is interesting to me because I read it at the time I was writing a book about Frederick Douglass, and he was contemptuous of Douglass. Yeah. He claims that Douglass changed his mind about the Constitution because Gerrit Smith gave him $500, right? And he's bought off. Right. So that book is remarkable in many ways, but it's an example of somebody who became too enamored of his subject, right? And it's outside of another strand in the historiography of abolitionism, which has long recognized that in taking the position he took on the Constitution and in taking the position he took on churches, Garrison rendered himself marginal to the larger anti-slavery movement. And it took me a while to realize, I come to the same realization, that the position he took, the famous burning of the Constitution as a compact with devil, was a marginal position, not only among the larger anti-slavery movement. You can't expect politicians to expect to get elected by burning the Constitution, but even among abolitionists, right? And that fight with Frederick Douglass is very indicative of an alternative turn among abolitionists toward not simply an anti-slavery constitution, but an abolitionist constitution, right? So Douglass and Lincoln are in a tense relationship, sort of, at least ideologically, until the Civil War, in part because Douglass's position is not the same as the mainstream anti-slavery position. Douglass has come to the conclusion that the Constitution is an abolitionist document, that it allows the federal government to do something almost no politicians believed, and most abolitionists didn't believe, that the Congress could actually abolish slavery in a state. Right? And that was such a complete violation of what historians call the federal consensus that it put him at the other extreme, if you will, from William Lloyd Garrison. But that just shows you the remarkable spectrum of ideas among anti-slavery people about the Constitution, and just exposes yet again why it's so misleading to focus on Garrison's interpretation of the Constitution when it was not the mainstream, and it was out of line with what I think is a more interesting radical turn in abolitionist thought about the Constitution.
It's not only not in the mainstream, I would add, I agree completely with all of that, Jim, but it's also very new. I mean, it's not as if people have been thinking there was a pro-slavery constitution. There was a Southern version of that came out of the convention that was there. But the anti-slavery side, this is all invented, really, in the 1830s. And indeed, even Garrison didn't believe it at first. I mean, if you read the Declaration of the American Anti-Slavery Society, which he helped basically wrote, there's all this stuff about going to Congress and trying to. It sounds he sounds like Lincoln would eventually sound, sort of. But he changes his mind in part because the movement gets nowhere, because it looks like the government is indeed stacked. A lot of Northerners are going along with it. He's getting led through the streets of Boston with a noose around his neck. It's not surprising to me that William Lloyd Garrison would have come to the conclusion that the Constitution is a pro-slavery document, given all that he experienced. Nevertheless, we have to understand that this thing that we take for granted as being just true was invented. It was invented, I think, first by the South, pro-slavery Southerners in and around the Missouri crisis, and then it gets picked up by some people in the 1830s. But they're a minority.
After Nat Turner?
Yeah, after Nat Turner, it would be right around then, 1831 to 1833, that I'm sure Turner had something to do, the Turner Revolt had something to do with that. But lots of things are happening between 1828, 1829, and 1833. That's a very compacted period. And it's in that period that the Garrisonian idea gets born. And so it's not anything that has a long tradition. It's something that's invented. People often say that Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, for that matter, invented an anti-slavery constitution. Well, everything that Douglass, well, not so much Douglass, but everything that Lincoln was saying had been said before. Going back to the 1790s. Been said before. So this has a tradition. This is the anti-slavery constitution idea that we were talking about before. No one's talking like Garrison before Garrison, if you see what I'm saying. So this idea that there's some sort of continuity in this is just wrong. It's an invention. The idea that Lincoln made up something in 1850, 1860, whenever, but that Garrison had it right, it's just the other way around. It was Lincoln who was continuing the long tradition, and it was Garrison who was making something up, in a presentist kind of way, given the conditions that he faced.
Garrison and John C. Calhoun saw eye to eye on that, I guess, in a way.
Well, that's a little misleading.
Okay.
John C. Calhoun is defending the pro-slavery Constitution, and Garrison is denouncing it. Although there's a superficial similarity in the way they read the Constitution.
That's what I mean.
I think it's important to realize that Garrison is not John C. Calhoun.
Although Douglass does say at one point, Jim, I think you quote him to this effect, actually, to saying that, in fact, he's being polemical, but he's saying there's no difference between Calhoun and Garrison.
Right.
And that's after he makes his turn. So
they say the Constitution is pro-slavery all the way. So Sean Wilentz, some other scholars have said, you invented something. The idea that the Constitution did not enshrine racial slavery. That's your argument in No Property in Man. I had Alan Taylor on in the most recent installment of this occasional series. He very politely and civilly disagreed with your interpretation. Well, you have a chance now to respond, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I've yet to hear a serious contestation of my argument, in the sense of show me the evidence. I put out the evidence. It's there. You can argue about whether I've interpreted it correctly or not, but that's not what happens. And what happens is people say that I make it up, or that I'm not really being, accurate, or what have you.
Well, you took it from Frederick Douglass.
Yeah, well, I didn't take it from Frederick Douglass. I'll tell you exactly where I took it from. I took it from James Madison. I took it from James Madison's notes. Now, James Madison's notes are a problematic source. There's no question about that. People have been examining that, and I did my best to try to take care of all of that, make sure I was taking that into account. But everything I say, I didn't even look at Frederick Douglass when I was doing this. In fact, I wasn't even terribly aware of what Frederick Douglass. I come at this from a slightly different places, Jim. Jim is a Civil War historian primarily, and does the middle of the 19th century. I come at it from the end of the 18th century into the 19th century. So I was interested in what was going on there. Now, I'd like nothing better than to have a debate over whether I'm right or not based on the evidence. And if anyone wants to come forward and have that debate in print or anywhere else, I'm happy to do it. But the critical reviews that I've seen, I haven't heard everything, but the critical reviews I've seen are mostly ad hominem and mostly accused me of bad faith, accused me of wanting to see something that wasn't there. They accused me of doing the same thing that they accused Douglas of doing, of making up something because I want to keep the Constitution, a good thing, that I love the Constitution, that somehow I have to whitewash the Constitution. That's nonsense. It's just nonsense. If you read my book, which I hope they have done before they criticize, it says quite explicitly that this is a contest. I'm not arguing that there was an anti-slavery constitution. I'm not taking the same position, in fact, that Douglas took. I'm not even taking the same position that Lincoln took. I'm taking the position there was a fight and there was a struggle from the beginning, and you can see the struggle very clearly. I lay out the evidence for that struggle. That evidence is there clearly in the best source that we have about what was going on inside the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. If you show me wrong, I'd be happy to say you've done so. But no one, literally no one, had done that yet. So that's my response to it all. Show me. I've shown you. Now go at it. Let's have it. I'd love it.
Can I make two additional points about this? Because the reaction to Sean's book is fairly similar to the reaction to mine. Both of us are arguing for a conflict, a contest over the meaning of the Constitution. But there's a good friend of mine runs a different history podcast, a Civil War history podcast, who in a passing remark after my book was published asked a guest if he agreed with James Oakes that the Constitution is an anti-slavery document. Right? And then a review of my book appears in The Nation, and the subheading is, in his new book, The Crooked Path to Abolition, James Oakes argues that the Constitution was an anti-slavery document. That is exactly what I do not argue. And it's exactly what Sean does not argue. And I do not understand this desire to erase conflict from American history. I just don't get it. The other point I want to make about the inability to deal with the evidence Sean presents, which is interesting to me, it's peculiar. There isn't a lot of evidence in the Constitutional Convention debates about a struggle over the meaning of property rights, but there are 3 or 4 very telling instances in which the issue arises. And in each of those cases, the delegates shoot down the idea that there should be property and man in the Constitution. When you do confront people with that evidence, and I have personally confronted, like Paul Finkelman, with that evidence, he will explain the evidence away. He will say, oh, Roger Sherman wasn't really serious. Or Madison said that not on the day, that it actually happened.
He said it 2 days later. He wrote it 2 days later.
They're not explaining the evidence that we have, and there's not a mountain of it, but they're explaining the evidence away. And I don't understand the desire to erase a conflict over something that was so central to early American history. I tell people, can you imagine American history from the American Revolution to the Civil War without a North and a South? You can't. You can't. And the only way you get that is if there was some significant conflict over slavery that came out of the American Revolution that produced a North that didn't have slavery and a South that did.
What's weird about this is the pro-slavery or anti-slavery ideologies that developed later. I think we talked about the 1830s, the 1820s. People are superimposing these back on 1787, kind of freezing it in time, when we know in the very first Congress of the United States of America, they were arguing over slavery and what the Constitution allowed the federal government to do with it.
Not only that, they consider a petition that was signed by a person who happened to be a delegate to the Constitutional Convention 3 years earlier, Benjamin Franklin. So no, it's there in Congress almost from the beginning. It's the second session of the first Congress is the big debate that occurs. But there's one other point that I wanted to add to what Jim was saying too, though. It's not just a matter of what is contained inside Madison's notes, what we know of the Constitutional Convention. There's a context around it. And there's been an argument about property and personhood and slavery that has been going on for at least 15 years, heatedly. And it's very much at the core of what's going on in terms of early Northern emancipation, which begins before the Constitutional Convention. In other words, these people are on record already as saying that slaves should be considered as persons, not as property. That's an old argument. Why is it an old argument? Because the first line of defense of slavery is always the property argument. It is always, it's not the race argument, it's the property argument. Under the laws that we've accepted, this is my property, property is inviolable, you cannot touch it. That remains the key defense of slavery right to the 1865 crisis, right to 1865. That is just the key. So it's not as if I'm making up a context. The context is overwhelmingly saying this is exactly what you would expect them to be arguing about in Philadelphia. It's not at one remove. It's not a seminar that they're suddenly having. Rather, they're coming from their various states. They're having these debates. They've been going on for years, and they bring them to bear. At the same time, the pro-slavery Southerners, they see what's going on. They're very aware of all of this. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney comes to the convention loaded for bear. He knows that that's going to come up, and he is ready to undo it any way he can. So in the context of what's going on all around the issue of slavery in the 1780s, I believe that the argument I make explains all of that much better than those who say that there was nothing there. You expect that a big fight that's been going on for many, many years all of a sudden stops when they come to Philadelphia, because the Northerners, some people will argue this, the Northerners take one look at Charles Cotesworth Pinckney and they suddenly begin to cower, and they're saying, oh no, we have to give them our way because we have to have our country. That's not what happened. The evidence may be limited, but it's eloquent.
Yeah.
That's
but
not
it all
what
points
happened.
in one direction. And
Correct.
It makes sense, as you say. These people, they had this argument in the Pennsylvania legislature. They had this argument in the New York legislature. You know, by the time you got to the Constitutional Convention, these arguments had been played out in New York and every northern state. You know, so that everybody knew what the argument was. It was always going to be about the moral, political, legal, constitutional, whatever legitimacy of property rights and human beings. That was the issue, and it remained the issue. And it's odd to me that when people write about the compromised Constitution, they don't actually talk about compromise. They actually write about capitulation, right? They only talk about the pro-slavery compromise as though the pro-slavery people didn't have to compromise with the anti-slavery people at the convention. So the simplest way to think about this is to think about what's contained in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which Congress meeting in New York at the same time that the Pennsylvania Convention is meeting in Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention, passed this ordinance. And the ordinance does two things. There's a trade-off built into it, right? It says, on the one hand, Congress can ban and will ban slavery in these territories, and will give you a fugitive slave clause in case your slaves run into those territories, right? The trade-off is built into that law, right? And many of those people who were in New York when they passed that law went down to Philadelphia and participated in the Constitutional Convention. And many of those people went into the very first Congress and reenacted that law, right? The trade-off is there. Congress gets the right to ban slavery in the territories, and in return, you get a fugitive slave clause. But we don't know what the fugitive slave clause actually gave them, because that's contested from the start also.
And can I add there, the fugitive slave clause in the Northwest Ordinance explicitly talks about persons held to service or labor. It goes out of its way not to define the slaves who run away to the Northwest Territory as property. They make that clear. That's been going on for a long time. If you wanted to deny the fact that slaves are property, you use that phrase. The phrase was not invented in Philadelphia. It's there in the Northwest Ordinance. It had been there. Rufus King had been talking about it earlier. It's the way that you do it. It's the formula for how you do it. That people can't see that is, to me, difficult to comprehend.
I want to return to some of these gradual emancipation laws, because I think this is an area where current politics or current racial fixations can distort how one views these. You can look back at these gradual emancipation laws and say, oh, they were only gradual, they kept another generation of people enslaved. But at the time, they were big deals, right?
Well, it didn't keep another generation of people enslaved.
I'm wrong about that.
It kept the people who were already enslaved before the dates that that they set right then. They remained in slavery, although the character of the slavery that they were going to be in was going to change as well. It doesn't end with the passage of these laws. There's a continuing movement. This is another thing that people don't see. They freeze the whole anti-slavery effort in those laws. Well, those laws are important, but they're the beginning in many ways of a process rather than the end of a process. What they do say is that people will remain, people born after this date right, shall have to be freed at a certain age, whether it's 18 or 21, or it varies from state to state.
Yes.
Now, that is often portrayed as a form of bondage, completely unlike slavery. That is simply not true. That is simply not true. So the idea that gradual emancipation is meaningless is wrong. Furthermore, there's a sort of schizophrenia in the literature. On the one hand, they say that gradual emancipation meant nothing. It was written by slaveholders for the slaveholders. It was compensation to the slave. It was reparations to the slaveholders. Some would argue that's what the gradual emancipation laws were all about. At the same time, they say that by the time you get to 1810 or so, there's this remarkable Black community that's working very hard to get rid of and complaining about emancipation as they'd experience it, but working hard against it. Where do those people come from? Where did they come from? Many of them came out of the movement for gradual emancipation and were in fact emancipated eventually when you get to that, by the time you get to the 1820s and so forth. So at the one hand, you have the emancipation laws changing nothing. And the other hand, you have this vibrant Black community that never existed before. It's crazy. It doesn't make sense. You can't have both of those things.
Jim, I'll allow you to jump in here, but I apologize for botching my question, Sean. I did know that.
No, that's okay.
Yes. Thank you for correcting me there. Jim, go ahead.
I agree with everything Sean said. I would add that not only is it important to understand that the first law passed is the first of many laws. New York continued to pass laws saying you can't sell a slave out of state, you can't break up a slave family, you can't, The 1780 statute, Pennsylvania Gradual Abolition Statute, the first such statute in the history of the world, grants slaves due process rights equal to those of white servants, right? So as Sean said, it's not just that they're gradually emancipating, which the emphasis on gradualism strikes me as peculiar. Gradualism just means when they become adults, they're emancipated, but, children are also emancipated when they become adults, and they're required to work for their parents until they're 21, and they have to, Lincoln, gives his money to his father and doesn't like it, things like that, and maybe even said, I was a slave once and stuff like that. So emancipating when you reach adulthood is the norm in American political, familial life, social life, and stuff like that. But those gradual emancipation laws immediately transform the status of those who are enslaved. And as David Gellman and others have demonstrated, they created incentives that caused slaveholders in places like New York to immediately begin entering into long-term contracts with their slaves, which resulted in a much more rapid actual emancipation than the statutes themselves would seem to indicate. So that by 1820, I think Van Gogh says this in his recent book, by 1820, 1830, there isn't any slavery left. You end up with a population of 250,000 free Blacks and 7 slaves in New Jersey in 1860, right, like that.
And yet, it's the 7 slaves that are pointed.
It's the 7 slaves that people keep on citing. Oh, there's still slavery in the North, without realizing that if you're going to keep harping on that, you're basically erasing this other important history that you want to say is important and is important, of the emergence of a very active free Black community that participates in this larger political movement to get slavery abolished everywhere. And in the process begins the first civil rights movement for Blacks in the United States.
It's important because it shows the government can act against this class of property. I'll give you some precise language here because, again, I really botched my question to Sean W. But here's the Gradual Emancipation Law, 1799, in New York. The first legislative act that freed slave children born after July 4th, 1799, when the women reached the age of 25, men 28. So again, you can look back at that from our vantage point today and say, well, that's not very fair. He still had to stay a slave for 28 years. But as you both just articulated, in context, it's hugely important in this story. It's a process. I think that's important to look at these issues as not as single events, but as a process. Just a minor digression here. I recently was speaking to a historian about the end of the USSR in 1991 and the collapse of communism. That wasn't an event. It's a process that's still playing out today for anyone paying attention to the news. Go ahead. whoever'd like to.
One quick thing. We have a similar issue in my own field when people talk about Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. The central question you need to ask is, why on earth would Lincoln issue an Emancipation Proclamation, and where did that come from? But an extraordinary amount of time and energy is spent answering a different question, which is, why did it take him so long to issue the Emancipation Proclamation? And that shifts the whole nature and tenor of the debate. The same thing is true of the gradual abolition statutes of the late 18th and early 19th century. The extraordinary thing in the larger history of the world and the world history of slavery is that these things happen at all. And the central question you have to ask is, why all of a sudden, in the last quarter of the 18th century, did governments begin to abolish a system that had been in place all the time? But instead of asking this momentous question that David Bryan Davis devoted his career to some extent, and Sean and I both live in his shadow, I think, Sean directly, me indirectly. But instead of asking that question and cogitating that gigantic historical question, we ask, why was it so gradual? Why was it so gradual? It's an interesting part of the story, but it's not even close to being the main story.
Can I jump in, Martin, on that? I think I want to back up what Jim said, but from a different angle, which is that one thing that Lincoln had to discover, for example, was how powerful, how strong slavery was. You know, for a long time, he had an idea that perhaps we can get Delaware, perhaps the border states. No, it was when he discovered just how powerful slavery was that he turned to the Emancipation Proclamation. I mean, that's when he decides, right? After he talks to the border state congressman and after he deals with Delaware. To give the other side of this debate its due, right? They're quite correct that slavery was an extraordinarily powerful institution in the United States going all the way back to the beginning. It's not as if the end of slavery was implicit in the Constitution. That's something else that I'm charged with saying, that somehow, you know, that the founding fathers knew this was going to happen, and so they built a Constitution which was going to destroy slavery eventually. Not true. I'm not arguing that. No one's arguing that. But what we are arguing is that indeed the power of slavery was great, extraordinary, and it only became greater with the birth of the Cotton Kingdom, okay? So the anti-slavery side is up against a lot. It's there. Now, you can look at that two ways. As Jim says, people will say, well, why didn't they just do it earlier? Well, they couldn't do it earlier because slavery was so powerful. So we can say that America bred a terrible institution. Yes, it did. It did. And it continued for a very long time. The point is that it was not everybody, not all white people were implicit in that. A growing number of white people came to oppose that power, but the power was very strong. And that's the reason why it didn't happen. It's the neglect of politics. There's politics here. There are people fighting. When people fight, some people are stronger than others, and that's going to change. And that's the story of what happens in anti-slavery in a very small nutshell. But if people will only concede what they themselves are saying, while admitting at the same time that there were some people who did not fit into that consensus and were fighting against it, then we can get somewhere. But at the one and the same time, they want to say that slavery is all powerful, and yet it was very weak because it should have been overthrown in 1787. That's crazy. You can't have an institution that's omnipotent and weak at the same time.
He's absolutely right. Sean is absolutely right. The schizophrenia that he mentioned earlier has another variation in this tendency to explain gradual abolition in the North on the grounds that it was economically unnecessary, having simultaneously argued that it's a more powerful institution. It's just as important in the North as it is in the South and things like that. And, you know, it's kind of insulting to the people who had to struggle mightily against this very, very powerful group of people. Grant that slaveholders are not as widespread in the northern legislatures and powerful in the northern legislatures as they were in the southern legislatures. But we're talking about an era of where property qualifications for voting and office holding are universal in the North, giving slaveholders disproportionate power in the northern legislatures, just as they had in the southern legislatures, just as they had in the House of Representatives. And they did not just cave in to this gradual abolition movement. They pushed back. And the reason it's gradual is because they pushed back.
Right.
It's because they pushed back.
And there were debates in the South as well. I learned this from reading William W. Freeling's books, The Road to Disunion. There were debates within the South about potentially getting rid of slavery in Virginia. I shouldn't say the South. In Virginia specifically. There was
some in Tennessee. There were some in the border states, too. It wasn't just Virginia.
Kentucky, there was some.
So Well, this is a question near and dear to Jim Oakes. We've been talking about the Constitution, but since you brought up Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation, was the Civil War from the start a war to end slavery, or did it become one?
I think that's the wrong way to phrase the question.
Go ahead.
The question is, was it always about slavery? And the answer is yes. Was it always a war to end slavery? In a sense, it never became a war to end slavery. The purpose of the war was always going to be the restoration of the Union. What it became over time, it was caused by the fact that someone committed to the ultimate extinction of slavery had been elected president. And they came into office, the Republicans. They took power in early 1861 in Congress and presidency with a set of ideas about what they could do to end slavery. And they begin to implement those ideas. And they had notions of what they could do more if there's a war, right? And they begin to implement those ideas. And what changes over the course of the war is as Sean said, they come to realize that slavery is not as weak as they might have thought it was, that the slaveholders or the non-slaveholders or whoever were going to resist emancipation more thoroughly and more effectively than they had expected. And they're radicalized by the war, and they push the war in an increasingly aggressively anti-slavery direction until sometime over the course of 1862, most Republicans, including Lincoln, come to the conclusion that the only way to suppress this rebellion and restore the Union is by destroying slavery. So it becomes a war to destroy slavery for the purpose of restoring the Union. But that doesn't mean they're not anti-slavery. It doesn't mean they don't hate slavery. It's not an accident that they come to the conclusion that in order to restore the Union, they need to destroy slavery. And in fact, if you read the debates in Congress in 1864 and 65 over the 13th Amendment, the Northern Democrats will keep saying, you guys are full of it. You're making this up. You're saying we can't have a restoration of the Union unless we destroy slavery, but you haven't even tried. You're making the destruction of slavery necessary in order to end the war, but you could offer peace to the South right now with slavery restored as well, and you're not even trying to do that. It's phony for you to claim that this is necessary to end the war. So it's not an accident that the Republicans come to the conclusion that in order to restore the Union, they must destroy slavery, because they come into the war committed to the ultimate extinction of slavery to begin with.
And to add to this, something that Jim's book, Freedom National, taught me was that from very early on, Republicans took it for granted, that secession by the South would mean the abolition of slavery, would hasten the abolition of slavery. And it's incorrect, I think, as Jim has taught me, to date the beginnings of emancipation to January 1st, 1863, or for that matter, to September 1862. The first abolitions beginning in August 1861. Fortress Monroe has something to do with it. The fugitive slaves has something to do with it. Although people were expecting, it's not as if Benjamin Butler suddenly thought, oh my God, what are these slaves doing showing up at Fortress Monroe? They've been spending, since the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, they've been doing nothing but talking about slaves running away from their masters. What did they expect if a war was going to start? Of course they expected it. They simply had no policy in place, and General Butler makes one up. But very quickly, they come up with a policy, and they're working on a policy. And that policy is based on the idea of emancipating slaves who come to Union lines one way or another. And how are we going to go about doing this? So this is going on, even as Lincoln himself is doing his thing in fighting the war at that level. On the ground, emancipation begins within the first 6 months of the war. And people have to understand that it's going on, that what Lincoln later called the friction and abrasion of war was going to undo slavery. Well, that was beginning very, very early on.
Right.
And this raises another issue about definitions, how they can get in the way of a clear understanding about what to call these anti-slavery politicians in the Republican Party from the 1850s on. I always believed or thought that the Garrisonians were the real abolitionists because they were calling for the immediate, uncompensated abolition of slavery. But Sean, to your earlier points about your book, No Property in Man, is it fair to call the first, say, anti-slavery members of the U.S. Congress abolitionists?
Well, many of them were. Benjamin Franklin, who's not in Congress, but he signed that petition, is the president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. So there's no shortage of abolitionists in and around Congress, shall we say. Absolutely. There's an abolitionist movement before. There's a first wave of abolition, as our colleague Manisha Sinha has put it, there was a first wave of abolitionism, not of simply anti-slavery, but of abolitionism before Garrison. Garrison's a second, more radical in some ways way, but a different way, but it's there from the beginning. And I think they call themselves abolitionists. They call themselves abolition societies. They call themselves abolition conventions. What they defined abolition as being is someone who was fighting for the extinction of slavery. There was no timetable for that necessarily. How could they have had a timetable? It hadn't happened anywhere when they began in 1790 or so. I mean, Haiti is going to come. Lots of things are going to happen. But they, from the very beginning, have the idea that the abolition, the extinction of slavery is their goal. That is what they want to do. And more than that, as Jim's student Paul Polgar has shown, those abolitionists are also, by and large, committed to an idea of racial equality. It is not simply that they want to end slavery and keep blacks in a subordinate position. They articulate very clearly, often working with African Americans like Absalom Jones and others. They make it very, very clear that after slavery, there has to be equality between blacks and whites. That's more radical in some ways than the stuff you're going to be hearing in the 1840s and 1850s. People like to think of the early abolitionists as, a bunch of gentlemen sitting around drinking sherry and saying, isn't it a terrible thing about slavery? Well, no. They are lawyers. They're working very hard. And they have an idea, actually, of racial equality, which is going to be much more difficult to uphold by the 1840s and 50s because there is a racist reaction to Northern emancipation in part, which makes a certain kind of virulent racism much more common, actually, in the United States between, say, 1815 and 1830. Jim Stewart, who is sort of on the other side of this debate, but nevertheless, he has a compelling point to make that what he calls racial modernity, it's not there from the beginning. It is something that gets invented itself and spread. But when you're talking about the 1790s, that wasn't there yet. And people could talk about racial equality, abolitionists could talk about racial equality with an ease that was going to be much more difficult later on.
I also think it's important to add that even Garrison and his folks, but that second wave of abolitionists looked back with admiration, notwithstanding the Constitution. They admired the anti-slavery record of their forefathers, right? And they wanted to go back to that record, even if they didn't like the Constitution. But most of them thought that the Constitution gave them the tools they needed with a couple of unfortunate necessary compromises, but they recognized what had been achieved during the Revolutionary era and the immediate aftermath of it, and they thought of themselves as building upon that.
So, Jim, the Republican Party of the 1850s and beyond, they kept that word abolitionism at arm's length, or no? Did they embrace that, or were they worried about being seen as radicals? I think that's an important question because, as I mentioned before, imposing definitions back in time can kind of cloud our understanding of what was happening.
This is where Garrison becomes historically significant. I think he was so conspicuous and his positions were so extreme, and these calls for immediatism and things like that made it easier for people like Abraham Lincoln and mainstream Republicans to say, I'm not one of those. I'm not an abolitionist. I'm just an anti-slavery person, operating in the same tradition that the founders established, and don't call me one of those. Even though the positions they're taking were, in the context of the time, increasingly radical. And my position has been, if you're in favor of the abolition of slavery, you're on the left end of the American political spectrum by the 1850s. And I'm not so concerned as earlier generations, and some historians still are, about parsing the distinction between who's the most radical. There has been a kind of cult of true radicalism in the scholarship. You find the most radical. That's what the Henry Mayer book does, right?
Yeah.
You find the most radical person and you hold them up, and nobody else measures up to that standard. And I'm less interested in that. Adam Tooze said one of the things historians want to do is explain how things happen, right? I want to explain how slavery got abolished. For those purposes, the distinctions between who is and who is not a radical are less important to me. They're interesting in the sense that, as I said, Abraham Lincoln and moderate Republicans had no problem saying I'm not an abolitionist if they could point to people like William Lloyd Garrison and say, I'm not one of those.
The Lincoln who eschews abolitionism is nevertheless building on arguments that were developed by people who called themselves abolitionists. Yeah. Political abolitionists. Everybody from Salmon Chase, who was an abolitionist, who later becomes Secretary of the Treasury and Supreme Court Chief Justice under Lincoln. He is an abolitionist. Their arguments grow out of an abolitionist position. John Hale in New Hampshire. I mean, you can go down the list of prominent Republicans.
Yeah.
But Lincoln is building on their arguments, and he's not denying that he's building on their arguments. So there is a continuity here that is clearly abolitionist, regardless of what the politics of the day say that you're going to call yourself. I mean, I can call myself all kinds of things. All my life, I've been trying to say what I am, and I've come up with different answers at different points. Nevertheless, there's a kind of consistency to the argument, which has been growing really from the very beginning, but that takes a very special turn after 1840.
If you listen to the rhetoric, to the justifications for secession, or you listen to the rhetoric of Northern Democrats in the immediate aftermath of Lincoln's election, they're pretty clear about what makes Lincoln and the Republicans radical. It's not like anti-communists finding Reds under the bed that aren't there. They're very specific about they're going to do this, they're going to do this, they're going to do this, and everything they're saying is correct. They are going to ban slavery from the Washington, D.C. policy. They are going to ban slavery from the territories. They are going to suppress the Atlantic slave trade. They're not going to return our fugitive slaves, and that's what makes them abolitionists, and that's why we have to get out of the Union.
And most importantly, they're going to prevent slavery from expanding beyond where it already exists.
I would say that that was one of the two keys. And I think the refusal of northern states to return fugitive slaves was also, right from the 1790s on, if not earlier, the second major source of irritation between northern and southern states, and is crucial to understanding why slave states secede. There are about 10,000 slaves, as best we can tell, escaped to the north or to Canada over the course of the 1850s, and maybe 300 or 400 get returned.
So to wrap up here, we're going to do book recommendations. I will take it upon myself to say to all of our listeners they should read, if they're interested in learning more about these complexities, 3 books to start: Freedom National by Jim Oakes, and No Property in Man and the Rise of American Democracy by one Sean Wilentz. Sean, I know I'm getting, a 0.001% royalty for mentioning.
You earned your pay, man. You earned your pay.
For mentioning your book pretty much every time.
I'm going to add a 4th book. I want to add Jim's book on Lincoln and the Crooked Road to Abolition.
The most recent one.
Freedom National is an amazing book, but there's a way in which the latest book actually hones in on Lincoln, which is something that people are interested in, and answers actually some of the questions you were asking at the very end there. So
the Crooked Path to Abolition, correct?
Yes.
Jim, any book recommendations? Nothing by Mr. Wilentz.
Oh, but I've been telling people for 25 years that I thought The Rise of American Democracy was the best book on the coming of the Civil War that they could read. So.
I have no idea. I mean this sincerely. That is the nicest thing I've heard in a very long time.
Best American history book I have ever read: The Rise of American Democracy. I mean,
well, but
I think the sequel that's on its way will make those 2 books together a real milestone in historical scholarship.
If we get there, we'll get there.
And Sean, I think you wanted to mention a couple of more.
2 books that I think are essential to understand anything that Jim and I have written, really, and anyone else who's written on the subject of slavery that are must-reads, are the 2 volumes by David Bryan Davis, the man who Jim earlier mentioned, is in whose shadow we both stand and many, many others stand. The Problem of Slavery in Western Culture and The Problem of Slavery in the Age of Revolution. And the reason they're so important, I think, one of the reasons they're so important, is that despite the fact that an argument here, an argument there, lots of interpretations we can argue about, they haven't argued about, some have been rejected, some have been modified. What both books show, I think, was the extraordinary power of slavery in Western culture and in American life, going back to the beginning. The first chapter, I think, of the second volume is entitled What the Abolitionists Were Up Against. And what you see was the power that they were up against. And that power was not going to decrease in the United States between 1787 and 1860. It was only going to get larger. And that's a paradox in American history that we have to own, because you could have an anti-slavery movement arising at a time when the United States is becoming the greatest slave power, perhaps in world history, who knows? But Davis, more than anyone else, is the person who brings you back to the beginnings of Western civilization and carries it through and shows how slavery is embedded in that civilization and how powerful it was. You can't understand the extraordinary achievement of the anti-slavery movements, not just in the United States, but everywhere, without understanding what they were fighting. And what they were fighting was enormously powerful, not just economically, not just politically, but socially, culturally. It was bred in a way that people don't want to take account of these days.
Thank you, Sean. Well, it did take a war, ultimately a war, and then the amendments to the Constitution to get rid of it. And you can see why some abolitionists, like Frederick Douglass, are probably getting frustrated after a while. Despite all their efforts, now there are 4 million slaves in the United States as of 1860, and they have the Senate as their bulwark.
Certainly, that's one of the major goals of the slaveholders in Congress, was to maintain in national politics, maintain their strength in national politics by increasing or maintaining a parity between the number of slave states and the number of free states, because they've pretty much lost the House, right? Because the population growth in the North outdid many of the effects of the 3/5 compromise. So their only hope, as they saw it, and I think they're right, was to maintain parity in the Senate so they could block all anti-slavery legislation. This is why it's so important to appreciate why so many debates over slavery that occur in the United States occur state by state by state. It's about Missouri, it's about Florida, it's about Arkansas, it's about Oregon, it's about Texas, their state fights, because at issue is the power of the slaveholders in the federal government with the addition of each new slave state.
Well, the other point about the Senate is that, and the presidency, which the South very much wants to hold on to, is that it's going to ensure control of the Supreme Court. If you can hold on to the 2 of the 3 branches of the federal government, plus control 1/2 of the 3rd branch, then you can sustain your power for a very long time to come. And that's precisely why Lincoln was such a threat, because they suddenly lost control of the presidency and they lost control of Congress, which meant that sooner rather than later, they were going to lose control of the Supreme Court, which only 3 years earlier had, in the Dred Scott decision, declared in effect slavery as a national institution. That was going to end. That was going to end in 1860-61.
So I need to thank both of you while you're still with me here for this amazing discussion. But I don't know, you have another couple of hours to debate the Dunmore Edict?
No.
I think I've said what I need to say.
That's a joke.
Dunmore Proclamation.
Yeah. Sorry, Sean.
No. I mean, the American public is probably more educated about that than anything out of this whole business. I think the debate on Dunmore has ended. And I think basically the idea that Dunmore's proclamation is somehow a kind of early precursor of the Emancipation Proclamation, as has been put forward here and there. I think that idea has been pretty well refuted, root and branch. And I'll say no more about Dunmore.
Well, a simple chronology solves that problem. The revolution was underway already.
Well, it's a reaction to a revolution that's already underway, not the precipitant to the revolution.
Yes.
The idea that George Washington was swayed to the rebellion when he had already been, at the head of the Continental Army for many, many months is slightly preposterous.
Battles of Lexington and Concord had already taken place.
Well, I thought we weren't going to get into this.
The argument is always, Lexington and Concord, the argument is it's only about Virginia now. It's only about Virginia, and Virginia was the one place. But, if you look at Virginia, there weren't that many Tories left in Virginia by 1775.
It's interesting. A year before the Dunmore Proclamation, Madison basically says, if we're gonna irritate this tension between the colonies and the mother country to the point of a rebellion, slavery is really going to get attacked, right? And there are Southerners saying that, right? They're saying if we rebel, they're going to attack slavery. If there's a need to protect slavery, what they understood was the best way to protect slavery is not to rebel. Well, they're saying it. Yes. They're saying very clearly they understood, just as the Republicans.
That's Dunmore's logic. Dunmore's logic is you want slavery, you have to stay with the empire. That's what he's trying to push by freeing all the patriot slaves. That's the argument. So what happens is they completely say, no, we'd rather have independence and threaten slavery and go through with it because we are patriots. So the whole argument is just absurd.
I apologize for even bringing it up, because here we are.
We forgive you. We forgive you.
Part 2 of the podcast will discuss the 1772 fairly insignificant.
Somerset.
Yeah, okay.
No. Somerset. No, I don't want to do Somerset.
The Somerset case. If you're unfamiliar with that case, there's a reason for that. It wasn't very important, not for the American Revolution anyway. We are indebted to Sean Wilentz and James Oakes for their time and insights. On the next episode of History as It Happens, is Ukraine the front line in a global struggle for democracy's survival? Francis Fukuyama, author of The End of History, says yes. And he'll be our guest next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast every Tuesday and Thursday from the Washington Times.